There were fewer missile launches, and that may be, because the previous episode did involve things flying very close to Japan, which is pretty provocative. But what they did do was apparently rehearse something that actually the Chinese armed forces have never done before, which is a joint air-sea and land forces exercise of the kind that you would have to conduct if you really were wanting to take Taiwan by force. It wasn't anything like the scale that of an invasion would require, but it did, for example, involve a Chinese aircraft carrier on the east side of Taiwan. So it was both an encirclement and, if you like, a kind of rehearsal of the kind of intimidation that would go with a real invasion.
So if you were the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, who, of course, travelled to the US and met the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, how concerned would you be?
Well, I don't think anyone is concerned exactly that an invasion is imminent, because that would be highly visible. I mean, it would require sort of 10 times the force that was mustered for this exercise. So in that sense, you wouldn't be concerned. But if you're the president of Taiwan, you are in a state of permanent concern about China's intentions, because China, in addition to its military options, has a whole suite of other things that it can do, from harassment, intimidating the population, all the kind of games with misinformation and disinformation that we've seen both China and Russia play elsewhere. It's an island that's actually very close to the mainland, and if it's not full of Chinese spies, I don't know what they've been doing all this time. So there are lots of things that can happen when China wants to put pressure on Taiwan, and much of it will be aimed at undermining Tsai Ing-wen politically, in the hope that the Kuomintang win the upcoming elections in January of next year. Tsai Ing-wen being ineligible to stand again, there will be a real contest for power in Taiwan.
What challenges does this present for other pro-Taiwan leaders, including the US president, of course, currently on his way to Belfast, or probably just arrived in Belfast. Of course, the French president who visited Xi Jinping in recent days. And of course, Britain, which wants to be a broker, wants to have heft in this diplomatic round. I mean, what about some of the challenges?
Well, the great concerns, there are two challenges. One, if it were to come to a war, it would be a global catastrophe, not just a regional episode. If you're planning to take Taiwan by force, and as a PLA planner, one of the first things you would have to do would be to neutralize American assets in the region, and that would involve attacking Japan. It would involve attacking Okinawa. You would probably also want to take out South Korea, which is a close ally of the United States. So very quickly you get into a wider war in the world's most important economic region, between essentially the global superpowers. So I don't think anyone can take this lightly at all. It's obviously of close concern to Japan, because Japan is right there, very much on the front line. And what's interesting is that we see in Japan, which has traditionally had a highly pacifist constitution, a much livelier discussion about the defense needs of Japan, and whether Japan should, for example, give military aid to Ukraine. So it's changing the strategic conversation in the region. I'm not sure that Britain has a particularly big role to play here. And President Macron surprised quite a lot of people, slightly negatively, by his visit to Beijing, in which he really appeared to favor the Chinese worldview at a time when China is trying to split the European Union off from the United States over critical issues like Ukraine.
Yeah, but when it comes to Taiwan, its defense ministry and the pronouncements from its senior officials, they don't appear to be cowed at all by their giant neighbor, which still retains a claim to them. Why do you think that is?
I think that, Taiwan has lived with this threat for decades. And if you were to regard the game as over at this point, it would be pretty hard to live with. I think that they are aware that a military assault would be a very, very difficult proposition and very uncertain, and would bring any number of different catastrophes, both to the region but also to China. China has never attempted anything of this order. When the United States forces looked at it in World War II, they decided that the cost of a military assault on Taiwan would be too high. So, it's not an easy proposition. And I think that they're probably worried more about the kind of slow attrition that can go on with this kind of campaign that Beijing is now waging against the island.
Right, and how much will their thinking have been reframed by how difficult their ally Russia has found its attempt to take over Ukraine?
Well, we like to think that the Chinese are drawing the right lessons from the situation in Ukraine, but they are militarily very different. The most obvious point being that Taiwan is an island, and that changes the whole game entirely. It changes the game both in terms of trying to get reinforcements in, but also for people it would be very difficult for people to leave in the way that Ukrainians have been flooding across the border into Poland, for example. That's very, very difficult to contemplate in Taiwan. The lesson that one would hope that China draws is that an occupation is a long and complicated and expensive thing when the population is hostile, and when the population is defending something that they greatly value, which is certainly true in Taiwan's case. So that might be a lesson, but we can't guarantee that that's the lesson that China is taking.